Hi guys, welcome to the video, thanks for clicking on it. Before we get started, if you could do me a massive favour and click the subscribe button if you haven't already. I actually looked at the analytics for my last video that I put up a week ago and 85% of the viewers weren't subscribed. So if you are not subscribed, you're on the video, if you could do me a massive favour, that would be much appreciated. As you can tell from the title of this video, I want to talk about how I bought my first property at the age of 23. And if you're in a position where you're looking to buy your first house, hopefully I can share some knowledge that will help you on your journey. Someone's just come outside with a dog and it started barking. I live in a big building with lots of flats in there, and one of the people that live in a different flat to me has recently got a dog, and it just, every time she comes outside to go take it for a pee, it just barks and barks and barks, and it's bad timing. So the reason I decided to buy a house was, I think, quite different to most people. It really started when I was 19 years old. I read a book called Rich Dad Poor Dad, which I don't want to say completely changed my life, but it was, I learned a lot from it. It definitely altered the direction of my life. And from that point at 19 years old, I decided, right, I want to get into property. And so for the next 4 years, I started saving up. And by the age of 23, I was eventually able to purchase my first house. So the reason for that wasn't so much to have a house, like I said, and live in it. It was more of a long-term plan, and that was I wanted to buy this property to live in initially, and I knew that I wouldn't be there for, the rest of my life. Yes, it was great to live there, and like I said, it's great to have a house, but it was mainly so I can get on the property ladder as an investor, because when you buy a property for yourself as like a residential property to live in, you can use a smaller deposit. Typically 10% is the lowest you can use, whereas if it's a buy-to-let, if it's straight directly for an investment, that needs to be typically 25%. So I knew that the easiest way for me to get into the property ladder as an investor, so I can start making money, was to buy it as a residential property and live in it, and then later down the line, turn that into a buy-to-let. So in the 4 years from the age of 19 to 23, I was reading books about property, about personal finance, attending courses and seminars, and watching lots of YouTube videos. And something that I learned was that this kind of term, it's this popular term on YouTube called house hacking. And what you can do is you can have your own house, you can live in it, and you can rent out rooms to lodgers. The number of rooms you can rent out really depends on the size of the property and your mortgage, but essentially that's what you can do, and you can make up to £7,500 per year tax-free doing that. So I thought, okay, I can put a small deposit, it's somewhere for me to live, and I can make some money renting out part of the property to other people, and it'd be tax-free up to, that's £7,500 is quite a large amount. And for me, in my situation, I wasn't in a relationship at the time, didn't have a family, didn't have any pets really, so I thought this is the perfect time for me to do this. I'd also recently graduated from university, so I was just into the job market, and my thought process was that I'm kind of at the beginning of my professional career. Hopefully my income is only going to increase, so if I can make a bit of a sacrifice now by renting out part of the property to other people and living with people I wouldn't necessarily choose to live with, in the hope that it would pay off in the long term, I thought that was a price I was willing to pay. So like I said, I decided I wanted to get into property in some way at the age of 19. So I diligently saved my money. I wasn't making much at the time, but this was in my first year of university, so it was pretty much working at the gym, at the University of Loughborough Gym, and in my summers I was working at EDF Energy as like a placement for 2 months. I wasn't able to save much, but because I knew I had this goal, I was slowly building this savings account that I was able to then use towards my property. And then when I graduated uni, I was making an income, and I was able to put that money towards the property purchase. Step one is to get an idea of what is your budget. So you can go onto any kind of major bank's website or a mortgage broker's website. You can use a function called the mortgage calculator, or just simply Google mortgage calculator. And what you can do there is put in how much you have in savings, how much you make from different sources of income, so whether you have a job, whether you work for yourself, pretty much any sort of income, put it in there, and that will then calculate how much you have to purchase a house. typically you'll need at least 10% of the property value. And once you've got an idea of the sort of value of the house that you can afford, the next step for me was to then go onto Rightmove and view properties within my price range. There's a function where you can actually pick the exact location that you want to buy property in and set your budget and see every single property on the market at that time. I then booked in as many viewings as I possibly could. I had to do them on Saturdays because I was working Monday to Friday, and I eventually came across a few properties that I liked, put some offers in, and I ended up getting a offer accepted on a property in Leicester, which I thought was perfect. A piece of advice that I would give to anyone is, if you're not buying a new build, you need to have a bit of extra money, more than that property cost, more than the solicitor and the cost to furnish it, because the seller can pull out. The property that I was going to buy used to be a buy-to-let, so it used to be rented out to tenants, and the seller realised about 2 or 3 months into the purchase of that property that when they sold the property they would be subject to a lot of tax that they couldn't afford or they didn't want to pay. So they decided just to keep it on the market and rent it out. So I paid quite a bit in solicitors fees to do searches on the house at the time, and obviously all that time and effort had gone into booking the viewings. I pretty much had to start the process again, and that's just something that that happens. There's nothing you can do about that. It's just a case of having that extra money. But if these things do happen, after that I basically just had to start from book more viewings, and a couple of weeks later I was able to find another property really nearby at a similar price, and which is the property I ended up buying. So when I viewed the property, I then put in an offer the next day, and we took a few days to negotiate and managed to get the price down a bit from what it originally cost. Once me and the seller of that property came to an agreement, I then needed to prove to the estate agents that I had the funds for the deposit. I had what's called a mortgage in principle. So when you put in your details on the mortgage calculator, you can get what's called a mortgage in principle from that particular lender to say that based on the information that you've put into the website, we would give you a loan of this much, which enables you to buy a house at this price. And that gives the estate agent some assurance that you can afford the property, and a bank will loan to you, so your credit score is good enough and you're a trustworthy individual. You also need to sometimes give a proof of ID as well. And once that's happened, the property will be taken off the market because it's had an offer accepted on it, and no one else can then get in and try and buy the property. And the next step for me was to give the estate agent my solicitor details, and they could then start the process of buying the property. And this is a very long-winded process. It typically takes anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It can take longer. And I don't know exactly every single step of that process, but that's not something you need to know. You just need to communicate with your solicitor, and if you have a good solicitor, they'll be keeping in communication with you a lot. Luckily for me, I was good friends with the solicitor I used, so I could just speak to them on a regular basis to get an update. They will guide you through the process. They'll say when you need to pay a certain fee, and they'll often send you forms that you need to fill in, as well as communicating with the mortgage lender or the mortgage broker, depending on which way you want to go. And after that process, that can take a long time. The solicitor sometimes will review the information about the property, and they will be discussing with the seller's solicitor any queries that they have, and they'll send you the responses to make sure that you're up to date with everything that's happening. And once everything's agreed, you will then have an exchange date. So this is the date that you're legally bound into buying the property, and this is when you'll have to pay the deposit and the solicitor fees to the solicitor. And after that day, you can't back out of the property, and if you do, you lose the deposit, and that will go straight to the seller. And typically, anywhere from a week onwards, you can then agree a completion date, and this is the time where the lender will arrange to have the funds for the mortgage, plus your deposit, and make sure all the legal work is done from the solicitor side, and that will get sent to the money will get sent to the vendor, and everything like the deeds to make sure that you own the property will get signed, and that's the day you'll get a call from the estate agent to be able to pick up the keys. And that is the process. It can take 2 months, but I'd say at least 6 months. Around 6 months is the typical from offer accepted on a property to actually purchasing it, anywhere from 4 to 6 months. So that's the kind of steps that I went through in buying my first property. Like I said, it was something I wanted to do for 4 years before I actually closed and picked up the keys for the property. And I think if you are in a similar position to I was, where you don't have a family and you're happy to live with other people, I would definitely recommend buying a property as a residential mortgage to live in yourself, but then renting out rooms to make an extra income that you can then have tax-free up to £7,500. And if you're not in that position, not a problem. This is just my experience of buying a house and something that I want to do for myself. I realise not everyone wants to do that, and probably most people don't. But if you are new to buying a house, hopefully that's still useful to you. It can be frustrating, it can take a lot of time, there's lots of forms to fill in, there's lots of letters you need to read through and send back. It's almost like a part-time job at some point. If you have any comments, please comment down below. You can also send me an Instagram DM. My Instagram is at brwhitford, WHITFORD. Just before we end the video, I wanted to go over some general tips that I've learned. The first one is when you're looking at getting a mortgage, I would recommend using a mortgage broker that has full access to the market, because they all have better deals than what you can probably find on the internet. Another option is, usually if you are banking with one of the high street banks, they will give you a better mortgage offer than someone that's not currently banking with them. So it's definitely worth checking with your bank to see what mortgage offer you can get. And that's typically a very good deal compared to something else. The second bit of advice is how much money to have. I know I've touched on this earlier, but I think it's definitely worth mentioning. So if you're buying a property for £100,000, say, and you're getting a 10% mortgage, loan to value, 90% loan to value mortgage, you're going to need to have 10% of that property value. So if you're buying it for £100,000, you're going to need to have £10,000 just for the deposit. There's also going to be solicitors fees, and depending on where you are in the country, it's going to cost around £1,000. And don't forget that if something happens during the process of buying a house where either you or the seller pull out the deal, the solicitor's fees that you've paid to do searches, anything you've paid will be lost, and that will have to essentially start the process again. Another bit of advice is, if you are in a position where you're living on your own and you are prepared to live with other people for a short amount of time, I would highly recommend looking on the government website about renting rooms, and just making sure that you are fully up to date with what's possible, because it's just an extra income source that will really help you out, especially if you're relatively young at the beginning of your career. It will really help you have that extra income on top. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. If you haven't already, please do click the subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.